Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for this very timely conversation. I'm Jason Marzak, Director of the Atlantic Council's Adrian Arch Latin America Center. Today's conversation is an important collaboration between our center and the Wilson Center's Latin America program. I begin by thanking Cynthia Arnson, who runs that program, who will co-moderate the discussion with me today. Thank you, Cindy, for your partnership and support as always. 3 days from now, Daniel Ortega will effectively run unopposed for a fifth term in office at a time when Nicaragua faces an unprecedented escalation and repression against political leaders, journalists, civil society activists, and others. Leading up to what's going to happen on Sunday, Ortega has incarcerated more than 150 political prisoners, including 7 presidential contenders. Earlier this week, it was also exposed that the Ortega government had taken a page from Russia's playbook by running a troll farm with more than 1,000 Facebook accounts promoting disinformation and amplifying pro-government narratives before the election. Taken together, these authoritarian actions by the Ortega government have effectively eliminated any vestige of democracy in Nicaragua, as the rights of the Nicaraguan people are curtailed, and they continue to suffer from a reckless response to the COVID pandemic. The implications of an emboldened Ortega government can have devastating implications both for Nicaragua and the broader region. But with the Ortega government repeatedly shrugging off mounting international pressure, calling for the release of political prisoners and the restoration of democracy, a coordinated response from the international community is all the more urgent and necessary to support Nicaraguans and their efforts to overcome this crisis. The OAS, the Organization of American States, voted 2 weeks ago by 26 member countries urging for fair elections and the release of political prisoners was an important but still not sufficient step in that direction. Additional actions are needed from the United States, regional neighbors, and the international community to raise awareness and apply pressure around Ortega's continued crackdown and find a path to restore democratic institutions in Nicaragua. Just yesterday, the House of Representatives passed a Senate bill introduced by Foreign Relations Committee Chairman Bob Menendez with Senator Rubio among the original co-sponsors that calls for more sanctions and other punitive actions directed toward Ortega. This is currently sitting on President Biden's desk. So with that, please join me in welcoming our 4 speakers for today's conversation. Laura Chinchilla is the former president of Costa Rica and also the first woman to hold that title, and a member of the Adrian Arch Latin America Center's Advisory Council. Isabel de St. Malo is the former vice president and former minister of Foreign Affairs of Panama, and the first woman in Panama's history to hold these 2 positions. Carlos Fernando Chamorro is a prominent Nicaraguan independent investigative journalist and founder and editor of Confidencial, a Nicaraguan news outlet. He's also the youngest son of former president of Nicaragua, Violeta Barrios de Chamorro. Since 2019, he and his family have been living in Costa Rica after facing threats from the Ortega government. And Patrick Ventrell is the Central America Affairs Office Director in the U.S. Department of State. Thank you all for joining us today for this conversation. For those watching, please feel free to submit your questions if you're watching via Zoom in the Q&A function. For those watching via another platform, please feel free to submit your questions on Twitter with the hashtag ACXWWC Nicaragua. Again, ACXWWC Nicaragua. You can also use that hashtag to continue the conversation writ large over Twitter. With that, over to you, Cindy, to begin the conversation.
Great. Thanks so much, Jason. Thanks to you and your team for this partnership. Carlos Fernando, we're going to start with you. You are the only Nicaraguan on the panel, although the other panelists obviously have a great deal of expertise. What are the 3 or 4 most important things that you think people in the United States and the international community need to know about what's happening in Nicaragua today?
Thank you, Cindy. The most important thing to understand is that Nicaragua is living since the last 3 years under a police state, and that means a suppression of freedom of reunion, mobilization, freedom of the press, freedom of the expression, and also the freedom of the right to elect and to be elected. And on Sunday, President Daniel Ortega will be re-elected with no electoral competition because all the opponents, all the candidates of the opposition and the political parties of the opposition are in prison and declare illegitimacy. And he controls the Supreme Electoral Council that will say that Ortega won with 70% of the vote, but according to the latest poll, 78% of Nicaraguans consider this election illegitimate without the participation of the opposition. And 65% will vote for an opposition candidate who is in prison, and only 17% will vote for Ortega. So we will see lines of people voting Ortega supporters and some other people like public employees and others who are under vigilance, and they have to show to the authorities the day after that they voted, but most of the people will stay at home protesting. Now, the question is on November 8th, the day after, what would happen? What would be the reaction of the Organization of American States, European Union, the United States? Will they recognize the results of this election, or would they declare Ortega's new government as a non-democratic dictatorial government? Whatever they decide, it is already known that Ortega will do whatever he can to remain in power. And that includes imposing a terrible damage to the Nicaraguan people. So unless there is maximum national and international political and diplomatic pressure, the prospect for change, unfortunately, are not optimistic. This will not be a sustainable dictatorship, but it can remain in power unless it faces strong maximum diplomatic, external and internal pressure.
Carlos, you mentioned the importance of international pressure. I want to turn now to President Chinchilla. President Chinchilla, what do you see as being the most significant regional impacts of what will transpire in Nicaragua this Sunday?
Yes, thank you, Jason. Certainly, this is an issue that doesn't only concern, or it is not only about the sake of Nicaraguan people. It also has to do with the instability, political instability of Central America, and also it has to do with the future of democracy in our hemisphere. As I have already mentioned in other occasions, if we analyze the impacts on Central America, they are going to be devastated. The crisis in Nicaragua will increase forced migration, which is one of the biggest concerns right now in Central America. And this migration will only continue coming to Costa Rica, as it has happened in the past. 8 out of 10 Nicaraguans used to come to Costa Rica. Now they are considering fleeing to the southern border of the United States. But secondly, it is going to create a disruption in regional trade and regional plans for economic recovery, when the region must need this kind of responses to tackle the problems related with the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. And something very important, this is also a threat to our regional security. Ortega is investing in military gear more and more, and that is creating an unbalanced situation vis-a-vis the other countries in the region. And finally, this situation is invigorating the undemocratic rulers. Ortega's re-election in a rigged process after following this path against human rights, against rule of law, will incentivize other autocratic rulers in Central America and beyond to follow the same route. But finally, let me tell you that since, according to my appreciation, the OAS has had a timid, limited, and delayed response to the Nicaraguan crisis, because because all of what is happening in our hemisphere in terms of intra-regional dialogue, the Nicaraguan crisis will call into question the effectiveness of our regional instruments and commitments to protect and defend democracy. So the consequences, again, go beyond the Nicaraguan frontiers and will impact in Central America and in the rest of the hemisphere. Let me just, final comments. It could also have impact on the credibility on Biden's foreign policy concerning the promotion and protection of democracy, because the question will be, what about the effectiveness of the policies? We recognize that they are concerned, but in a certain way, it is going to be very hard to understand why 3,000 kilometers away of the southern frontier, in the heart of the Americas, we are about to have a North Korean style regime, because it is a dynastic, dictatorial, and also it is based on the use of the military force in order to stay in power. Thank you.
President Chinchilla, you've mapped out very clearly the consequences for Central America as well as the rest of the Latin American region, if not the world. I would like to ask Vice President Sembalo if you could talk about what Central American countries, Panama, Costa Rica, others, could do, and how the international community should respond to what will take place in Nicaragua this Sunday.
Thank you so much, Cindy. First of all, I would like to emphasize that we really shouldn't be looking at the Central American response. President Chinchilla has been very clear this goes well beyond Central America. This is a hemispheric issue. This is an issue that the international community as a whole needs to take into consideration. And Carlos Chamorro mentioned something that I think is the key to the next steps. He says, what will happen the day after? Well, the day after, we need to prepare. The international community needs to be ready the day after to be very strong, coordinated, specific. We know what is going to happen on the 7th. It's not like we need to wait and see. We know what will happen since there are no opponents participating. There is no freedom of expression. There is a police state, in Carlos Chamorro's words. So we know what will happen on Sunday. The question is, what will happen on Monday? And on Monday, we need a strong, committed response, immediate condemnation of the results of the process, non-recognition of this mandate. And we should all have into consideration, if this mandate goes on, Ortega will be the longest serving ruler in Nicaragua in a long time. It will be a total of 28 years if we allow them to end this new illegitimate term. So immediate response. And what does this look like of non-recognition? Withdrawal of ambassadors, expelling from OAS and other multilateral organizations, cutting financial flows. And I understand, and this has been mentioned, all of these measures will also hurt the Nicaraguan people. But I think we have a very small window where measures could be strong enough and ready to have some kind of result, or else we can be seen, and President Chinchilla mentioned North Korea, but maybe we can look even closer. We have a couple of regimes within this hemisphere where people are really suffering a humanitarian crisis as a result of autocratic, undemocratic governments where there are no elections. It's not just the fact of not having democracy. It's the fact of not having democracy and having autocratic regimes that are making people suffer very, very much. So I think the response needs to be immediate. It needs to be coordinating, non-recognition, measures, sanctions, cutting financial flows, and other sanctions, not only to the country, but sanctions directly to individuals linked to this autocratic, undemocratic regime.
Thank you very much, Vice President St. Malo. Patrick, I think the first speakers have queued up my first question for you. Carlos spoke about the importance of action that the day after the election. President Chinchilla, Vice President St. Malo have both warned about the implications of non-action or less or more timid action. The Biden administration has already taken a number of actions with regard to Nicaragua. And of course, democratization, the Democracy Summit will be occurring in just about a month in early December. What do you see, Patrick, as some of the tools that the administration has at its disposal to achieve the goal of democratization, in addition to the tools that have already been deployed, as well as the importance of international community coordination that the speakers have spoken about, that I know is a priority, of course, for this administration as well?
Well, thanks so much for that, Jason, and thanks for the question. It's great to be here with you all, and greetings from the State Department in Washington, and to my distinguished panelists. I think they set the stage really perfectly. I mean, I think the scenario here of a regime that has determined and is absolutely determined to hold on to power at any cost, that has made clear that, as President Chinchilla said, basically that they're going to hold on to power basically with the military forces is spot on. Carlos's description of the credible polling that we've seen and just the widespread rejection of what is happening underscores that what Ortega and Murillo are about to do does not have the consent of the Nicaraguan people. And so from the U.S. perspective, we'll be quite clear. We've said it before that these elections will have no credibility, that they're a sham. We'll continue to say that afterward. But I think the strategic context is that, precisely as been laid out by my fellow panelists, we're going into a state where, or into a scenario where you have a dictatorship. And we'll have to respond to such. And democratic institutions in the hemisphere and beyond are critically important to us in the Biden-Harris administration and for the United States. And so we will absolutely use the tools at our disposal. As you mentioned, there are some that we've already used, including sanctions and visa restrictions and other measures that the U.S. Can take. But we're also going to work multilaterally. And I will say, as I've been in discussions with a number of different partners, that there is no love lost for the Ortegas and what they are doing. And so we will coordinate very closely with a broad coalition of countries to come together and to increase the pressure, because ultimately what the medium-term perspective here is, how do we advance democratization? How do we get Nicaragua back on a path toward democracy? And what's going to happen this weekend is going to take it much farther away from that path. It's going to be hard, but we remain determined that we will work together and with like-minded partners to use these tools that we have to increase the pressure and to support the Nicaraguan people, because I think that's ultimately is what at stake here today. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick. Before moving on to more questions, I'd love to give an opportunity for speakers to make additional comments with regard to Patrick's last comments or other things you might have heard as part of this first round that you'd like to reinforce. Especially Carlos, you spoke first. If you have additional thoughts based on the comments that other speakers have laid out there, would certainly welcome that from you and from anyone else.
Jason, if you allow me, we have to recognize that yesterday there was a very positive signal from Congress, U.S. Congress. They decided to approve finally the Renacer Act. And what is most important about this law is that it doesn't only allow the United States authorities to impose more sanctions, but also it calls for something that has been missing in the region for many years right now, and not only in the case of Nicaragua, but also in Venezuela, and that is about aligning the diplomatic strategy with the economic sanctions. So in certain way, that is the key issue in the aftermath of November 7th. Because I am sure that we will be able to get many declarations issued by many countries around the world, denying the results. Probably we will have the European Union countries taking some additional sanctions. I'm sure that the United States administration will do it as well. But if they don't decide to design a concerted, coordinated, and coherent diplomatic strategy, the sanctions won't act alone. We already have the example in Venezuela and also in Nicaragua. United States already imposed some sanctions, and Daniel Ortega continued doing what he wanted to do. So that issue about the diplomatic strategy, I think, is the most important thing in the days following November 7th.
Thanks, and we'll come back to the Renacer Act, which is one of the questions that's been posed by the audience. Carlos Fernando, back to you. What do you think will be the impact of this election on human rights in Nicaragua, and particularly the future of the political prisoners that are in jail? Over 150 including the opposition candidates and members of the private sector and student leaders that have been arrested in this wave of repression since May. And related to that is a question from Daniela Martinez from the Global Fund for Children, which has to do with how funders in the international community can help human rights and civil society organizations in Nicaragua without putting them at further risk.
Well, all political prisoners are hostages for Ortega. There are 150. 120 had already been sentenced, and they're in jail for 1, 2, 3 years or more. And these other 40 political prisoners that have been detained between June and August this year. Ortega had already suspended the political trials that are taking place in prison. And I believe he is going to decide the timing, the political timing about how to impose the guilty sentences for all political prisoners, because the final objective of the dictatorship is to inhabilitate them politically, to eliminate their political rights. So the most important demand of Nicaraguan society, and I hope that will be shared also by the international community, is to demand the liberation of all political prisoners. This is not a question of also, it all starts with eliminating torture, but it's not a question of good treatment in prison. All of them are innocent. They're being accused of criminal fabrication, about conspiracy or treason to the homeland or whatever. I myself am accused. I am in Nicaragua. There is an order of arrest against myself. That's why I'm in exile, like many other journalists. So we need the liberation of our political prisoners and the cancellation of the political trials, so to preserve their political rights. I think Ortega could decide different ways about administering or giving the image of improving the treatment of some people that have been in torture. All of them, all those 40 who are in El Chipote are in isolation. That's torture. So that may change, but to those people who said what to do without having any consequences to the political prisoners, my own point of view is that they have to raise their voices, that there has to be a larger national and international alliance. We hope Pope Francis and the Vatican will join this world call to the liberation of political prisoners. Silence doesn't help, only awareness, only putting pressure for this first demand of political change in Nicaragua.
Carlos, thank you. I think an incredibly important message as part of this, what we hope is one of the outputs of this conversation is not to be silent. We need more people in the international community raising awareness, not only of what's happening on Sunday, but of all the political prisoners and others in exile unfairly, all innocent, all being used to Ortega's advantage. President Chinchilla, we've talked in the past about migration and the increased push factors of migration of the situation in Nicaragua. We've already, of course, begun to see that. What do you see as the future challenges for regional migration after what will happen this Sunday, and as well as part of the increased authoritarian grip that Ortega will have over the country?
Well, for sure, the situation is going to get worse. If we, if we only take the people, the number of people who left Nicaragua since April 2018, it is about more than 100,000 Nicaraguans. So it will mean that if Ortega decides, to stay in power, and economic sanctions are also to be imposed, the economic situation inside Nicaragua is going to be aggravated, which basically means people trying to escape out of this situation. But as I mentioned, in this occasion, what we are seeing during the last months is that 6 out of 10 Nicaraguans are moving towards the southern border in the United States. And that will mean more pressure on the Biden's migration policies, and also more pressure on the plans to do something about the Northern Triangle. And that is why, once again, this is not only going to be about a humanitarian crisis, and I take this opportunity to call for the intervention at that level. We have to put in place as soon as possible some humanitarian responses. We are not receiving much of this right now, while at the same time, we will need to think about the future plans of the Biden's, well-intentioned plans of the Biden's administration concerning the Northern Triangle. So the impact is going to affect migration, the humanitarian situation in Central America, and of course, the plans that Biden's administrations have for this part of the world.
The next question for Vice President Saint-Malo. We've been talking about what can be done to improve human rights, to do as a first step the freedom for political prisoners and the suspension of these sentences, which are fabricated charges. When you look back at, say, the history of human rights abuses in Latin America, what do you think have been some of the most effective tools in promoting respect for human rights, and what, if any, of those things should be applied now in the Nicaraguan case?
Thanks again, Cindy. First of all is the recognition that there is a human rights crisis in Nicaragua. There is not only a crisis with the elections to be held on Sunday, which are a sham, but there is also a human rights crisis, and we only need to look at the political prisoners and the repression and the stopping of dissent, which support all of that. If we look back, I would say that human rights violations, very similarly to undemocratic practices, are something that by authoritative regimes do not come because they change their mind, do not come because they all of a sudden decided to abide by international norms and regulations. Unfortunately, they need to be pushed, enforced, and demanded by the international community. So I think that here, again, the countries within the hemisphere that value these democratic institutions, that value the respect for human rights, need, and I believe that the Biden administration has a very important role to play there. So I celebrate Patrick's message of support. And as President Chinchilla has already mentioned, the passing of the Renacer Act yesterday was very, very important, because we need to denounce, and this denunciation needs to come accompanied by strong countries, and we need to lead the condemnation of those violations and demand the freeing of political prisoners, demand the end of repression, demand the end of harassment, and demand the end of impunity. And that will not happen because they all of a sudden decide to. This needs to be a part of the demands that take place aligned with the measures, aligned with the sanctions. And I want to take a minute to go into that. It's not sanctions because of sanctions. It's not non-recognition for the sake of it. It's non-recognition, sanctions to achieve a result. And what is that result? The result is a change of situation in Nicaragua, ensuring that there is a plan, of course, beginning by the immediate freeing of political prisoners. That needs to happen immediately. And then there needs to be an electoral calendar with minimum steps taken so that electoral calendar is respected. And a quick note here on dialogue. And I am and have always been a very strong believer and supporter of dialogue, and I still am. And dialogue is always better than the alternative, which is violence. However, it's not dialogue for dialogue. If dialogue is the way, there need to be some messages that this is serious. And messages need to be clear. Freeing political prisoners immediately, establishing an electoral calendar. It's not a dialogue to buy time to know more of what we already know. So the sanctions, the measures, the demands are with one objective in mind. And that objective in mind is to return democracy within Nicaragua, and whichever road we take, and if dialogue is one of them, because I can clearly see it. I can clearly see it within Nicaragua 3 days after the election, and the international community denouncing. I can see a very heroic call from the government to sit down around the table. But that needs to happen accompanied by some very clear signs that it's not just to have a conversation and to buy time to know what we already know and what we have known for a very, very long time.
Isabel, if you would let me follow up with a quick question, and this is, I think, a more sort of existential question for the whole panel. I couldn't agree more that the Biden administration has to be in the lead in demanding freedom for political prisoners and an improvement of the human rights situation. That said, history didn't start yesterday. The United States was the main backer for decades of the Somoza dictatorship until the Carter administration, and even then up and down. And then the Reagan administration launched the so-called Contra War to overthrow the Sandinista government, and this took place for about 5 or 6 years in the 1980s. So the United States doesn't come to the Nicaragua situation without a past. And Daniel Ortega, certainly as part of this revolutionary junta that was in power during the time of the Contra War, I'm sure also remembers that earlier time. So maybe that's a good lead into Jason's next question for Patrick, but I do put that out there because I think the United States has a certain significance for Daniel Ortega and for the Sandinistas in general that has to be part of our thinking about the authority that we use to come to the Nicaragua situation.
That's a great point, Cindy. Let me transition out to you, Patrick. unless anyone wants to make a comment on that point. President Chase, you took yourself off mute, so please go ahead. President, did you have a comment on that?
I think you were asking to Patrick. No, I'm
No,
so sorry.
No, please. I wasn't sure if you had a specific response to that. So if you did, please go ahead. Otherwise, I'll move on to Patrick or Carlos. If you have.
Of course. It is undeniable that the United States is called to play a leading role right now. Of course, when we look back in other kind of situations, there was not only about the United States, but also about the some leading nations of our hemisphere. They come together and they were able to bring alternative plans to the situations we had in our region. That was the response that was intended. For example, in the face of the Reagan's administration to support the Contra efforts to overthrow the Sandinista government. Some nations came together, the Contadora Group and Central American nations. But unfortunately, we have to recognize that right now, there are not possibilities to bring many nations together to resolve the situation in Nicaragua unless the United States gets involved very directly in those efforts. I have to praise, for example, for the role that Canada is playing. So we have a very important ally there. But certainly, I would very much recommend to expand the working group at the OAS, the working group on Nicaragua, the OAS, to bring some other nations so they can be able to align the nations at the OAS in order to effectively respond to what is coming after November 7th.
Thank you. Patrick, I want to turn to you. There has been reporting that that there has been a review beginning of Nicaragua's membership in CAFTA-DR. Officials have warned that Nicaragua's membership could be in jeopardy as well as a result of the elections. There is, at the same time, of course, a lot of different kind of mechanisms that would have to be adhered to as part of that. It's would be incredibly complicated. There's been discussions insofar as what is the most effective way to levy additional punitive actions on Nicaragua, of course, in a way that doesn't hurt the Nicaraguan people that are already, as we've been discussing, suffering so much. I want to ask you, Patrick, how the U.S. is looking at additional actions, especially talking earlier about migration. And I also want to bring in, there's a question here from Mary Beth Sheridan from the Washington Post, and she asked, to what extent is the Biden administration concerned that the result of the election could fuel more irregular migration from Nicaragua to the United States? And how concerned is the administration over what is already a big jump in such migration? So taking Mary Beth's questions about concerns with regard to migration, and then also how to reconcile those concerns with potential additional punitive actions taken as part of the election this weekend.
Thanks for that, Jason. A couple comments from me. First of all, going back to the sort of historical comment that Cindy made, would just briefly note, number one, that the U.S. is going to show leadership and do so multilaterally, and then number two, that one of the sort of bitterest ironies of all of this is that quite frankly, the Ortega Murillo regime is basically turning into a family-led dynastic dictatorship, just like the one the Sandinistas overthrew 40 years ago under the Somoza family. So they've turned into what they were once originally against. On to the migration issue, we take it very seriously. I welcome everything that President Chinchilla has said. That wave of migration is already coming. There are now more Nicaraguans arriving at the southwest border than Salvadorans. in recent months. And so that wave of hopelessness, of anxiety amongst those not only who have been directly politically repressed, but those who don't see a future because of Nicaragua's future and are voting with their feet and leaving the country, not only as they traditionally have done to Costa Rica, but to the U.S. is already happening. And so we see that as a serious national security issue, and are obviously deeply concerned. And it really underscores, as we look out at this broader Central America strategy, the fact that how key good governance and economic growth are toward a stable and secure and prosperous Central America. And obviously Nicaragua is the most extreme example of what happens when you go down the wrong path, and is serving as sort of the worst in-state model, but also is going to, as former President Chinchilla mentioned, be a major impediment for our larger regional project. And so we're deeply concerned, and we are going to. That's part of why we take the situation in Nicaragua so seriously, in addition to all that it means for democratic institutions in the hemisphere. On CAFTA-DR, first of all, on the Renacer Act, very pleased that it passed yesterday with wide and broad bipartisan support, and a lot of hard work on Capitol Hill went into that. I don't, of course, I've been in the State Department long enough not to get ahead of the White House, and I don't want to speak in terms of timing. But indeed, we'll be ready for the president's signature shortly, and hopefully we'll have updates for you on that in coming days. And there are specific measures in there, for instance, about reviewing Nicaragua's participation in CAFTA-DR. I mean, already we're going to use the tools that we have to review their participation in any of the U.S.-sponsored assistance or trade capacity building programs that are part of CAFTA-DR. We're always looking to promote good governance and transparency, and clearly that is not what is happening in Nicaragua. But I don't want to get ahead of myself on that review, and obviously there is an incongruence in terms of what is now going to be an authoritarian dictatorship participating in free trade with the United States. But of course, it is a multilateral trade agreement, and we are not trying to harm the Nicaraguan people either. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Patrick. Over to you, Cindy.
Sure. Let's see. This, I think, will be a question for Carlos Fernando, but it's also, I think, a question for many members of the panel. The OAS has passed several resolutions 2 weeks ago, back in June, condemning what was happening in Nicaragua. These passed by large majorities. And just a few days after the Nicaraguan election, the OAS is going to be hosting its 51st General Assembly. So there is a provision under the Inter-American Democratic Charter for expelling from the OAS nations that are failing to uphold democratic principles. What do you see as the advantages and disadvantages of invoking Article 21 of the Democratic Charter and actually expelling Nicaragua from the OAS? So Carlos Fernando first, and then invite the rest of the panel to weigh in on that issue as well.
Well, I don't have the proper information about the political balance in the OAS, whether there are the votes and the conditions to invoke Article 21 of the Inter-American Democratic Charter. Well, they didn't do that in the past. I don't know if they can do that now. What I can say is that the OAS failed in Nicaragua during the second national dialogue in March 2019, when Ortega agreed with the opposition to restore all democratic political freedoms and to suspend the police state. There was an OAS witness as representative in this dialogue, as well as the representative of the Vatican. Ortega didn't do anything, and the witness they could not guarantee the agreement that was established in that dialogue. I think that's a key moment in this crisis. I don't know how they can put together the missing link between any kind of international condemnation, pressure, and the restoration of political freedoms in Nicaragua. The solution to this crisis is not in Washington or in Brussels or in Guatemala's meeting next week is in Managua. But we require the restoration of political freedoms, freedom of reunion, freedom of the press, freedom of mobilization. So unless international pressure, whether through the Inter-American Democratic Charter or through the action of different nations that will have some kind of a route of actions, will have an impact internally in Nicaragua in the restoration of political freedoms, I don't see any positive impact. And just one last thing, I think it's important to support those organizations of civil society, Nicaraguans, like the Catholic Church, even the business class. The corporate business class in Nicaragua will have an important role either to shorten or to prolong the Ortega's agony if they decide or not to act as a civic actor in this crisis. Right? At this moment, they're all paralyzed. They're all in fear of reprisals from the government. Well, I think this is a question also that affects the Central American business leaders community as a whole. And that's the way I would see the connection of the OAS. And one last thing would be the Central American Economic Integration Bank. That's been the main source of support for Ortega in the last 4 years, $2 million. $2 billion between 2017 and 2021 in terms of very important loans. What will happen at the Central American Integration Bank? Would that ever change? If the Central American partners do not want to do anything, well, probably the other partners like Spain, South Korea, or Argentina, Mexico could do something about the way in which this regional bank is supporting the Ortega dictatorship.
Vice President Zamalo, please go ahead.
Yes, I wanted to add something to that question. Thank you. And Carlos Fernando mentions, will we have the votes at the OAS? We don't know. I just want to highlight that, as we all know, the OAS it's not an island. The OAS is the sum of its members. And what has happened over and over again at the OAS, when votes such as Nicaragua, Venezuela, votes that are relevant and that will shake because they are applying the instrument that the organization has, what happens is that movements start to happen, pressures start to happen, and really getting the votes will depend at that moment of the votes of the work done by democratic countries wishing to support a result. I have seen many, many times, unfortunately, that those that are undemocratic move faster than those that aren't. And I am not blaming anybody or any country. I include my own country when I was in office. At the end, these are political decisions. And at the end, if every government has their own internal problems and the measures and the weights start to be analyzed of the backlash that you will have, whether for supporting one side or for supporting another, that is the reality. So if this is taken to the OAS, and I hope it will on the next assembly, and I hope we don't need to wait for the results of the elections to be announced, because that can happen again as well. It can happen that we have elections on the 7th and that they take 2 weeks to announce results. That shouldn't matter because the sham is already in place. So we know what the results will be. At the point where the organization is considering any decision, democratic countries need to work on getting those not sure of their position. And that will be the majority within the OAS. The majority will be those that are waiting to see where is the most damage to my own country, to my governance within my country. Remember that we're all facing reconstruction after COVID. Every country in the hemisphere has enough issues on their own. So there's got to be some kind of support for taking the correct decision, which is the restoration of democracy in Nicaragua.
Thank you, Vice President. I want to go to President Chinchilla. President Chinchilla, you also, in addition to you mentioned at the outset, the timid, limited, late response by the OAS that calls into question the effectiveness of regional institutions and frankly, the inter-American system. So I'd love to get your comments on what more the American system could and should be doing. Also, as part of that, there's a question from Richard Sanders, who points out that Mexico and Argentina have been reluctant to join the hemispheric consensus regarding Nicaragua, and to what can this be attributed, and what more can be done?
In my criteria, it is going to be very hard to justify the absence of concrete actions coming from the General Assembly just 3 days after the electoral farce in Nicaragua. It's going to be very hard. And even more when you are talking about a government who has no support in the hemisphere. I mean, nobody voted in favor of the Ortega regime at the OAS during the last voting, during the last resolution that was voted there. So in my criteria, they should invocate Article 21 of the Inter-American Democratic Charter during the next General Assembly. In the same way they did it with Honduras at that time. And because I don't know how they are going to justify it. Look, the General Assembly has already approved 2 resolutions, and the Permanent Council, I don't know, I think it's about 6 to 8 resolutions. So what else? What else is there? It's only moving, very consistent, applying sanctions, but again, and I want to be very clear about this. It's not only about the sanctions; it's about having a effective diplomatic strategy. Because at the same time, they will need to open some venues for dialogue with the Nicaraguan authorities. Now, just to finalize, let me just mention 2 important actors where we also have to focus in the days to come. One is, and with Carlos Fernando already mentioned, the business sector. They should ask themselves, what is the price they want to pay for restoring democracy in Nicaragua? Civil society and political leaders are paying a very high cost. I understand they are very concerned about the Renaissance Act because of the consequences on the CAFTA deal. But again, they have to ask themselves, what is the price they are willing to pay for restoring democracy? And I don't see that very clear right now. Secondly, is the financial institutions. They must be aligned with the concerns coming from the human rights organizations. There is no longer justifications to only look at the macroeconomic indicators and the fiscal indicators and disregard the human rights and democratic indicators to finance a regime like the Nicaraguan regime. And finally, the military. The military was too close to the Southern Command. Very recently, a representative of the Southern Command, appeared with their colleagues in Nicaragua, praising the Nicaraguan army. So that is something also that we have to put attention in the days to come.
Great. I'm going to ask another question for Patrick, but I have to add a couple of questions from the chat to this. Patrick, it's about Biden administration policy, but also in this wider multilateral context that you were talking about. As Jason mentioned, there will be a summit of democracy on December 9th and 10th that President Biden has called. Next year, the United States will host the Summit of the Americas. How do you see Nicaragua playing into those conferences and those major meetings. And related to that is that in any effort to change behavior, there are certainly sticks, and we've talked a lot about sanctions and other forms of pressure, but there also need to be inducements. And there were questions from the audience, from Shelley McConnell, who's written a lot about Nicaragua, from Cesar Zucco. What, if any, are inducements? What are things that could be offered to Ortega, Rosario Murillo, to get them interested in a negotiation? Go ahead, Patrick.
Good. Thanks for those questions. First, with the upcoming OAS General Assembly and then into the Summit for Democracy and then the Summit of the Americas, I think Nicaragua is a cautionary tale and one that will absolutely be on our minds and be at the forefront of our discussions in that regard, and a really clear case of a breach of the democratic order, and something that we'll talk about in those multilateral fora extensively, because Nicaragua is really a cautionary tale indeed. In terms of the second item about inducements, I mean, quite frankly, I don't think we're at that stage right now. We've got a dictatorship that is quite dug in. We're going to continue to use pressure at this phase. And really, I think the broader question is about what is the long-term support for the regime. I mean, I would throw it back to the very beginning of our discussion and the Sid Gallup polling and the deep distrust that a wide swath of the Nicaraguan people has for this regime, probably including many Sandinistas themselves. And so what we want is, rather than an inducement for the regime, is perhaps an inducement for the wider Nicaraguan people to have a path, a broad-based path back toward democracy. So I think that's the way we look at it right now. Obviously, there's been plenty of bilateral outreach to them over the years, and they've made clear where they stand on that.
Thank you so much, Patrick. We're almost out of time. I want to be remiss if I didn't ask one more important question about the role of the European Union. The EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell is currently in the region. He was in Lima. He's now on his way to Brazil. He has been very outspoken in calling the elections fake, calling Daniel Ortega a dictator, and his trip to Lima called the situation in Nicaragua one of the most important situations in the Americas. So I want to end on that note and ask a question with regard to additional actions or concrete steps. This could be for you, Vice President St. Malo, additional actions or concrete steps that you envision the EU taking, especially in coordination, of course, with the United States and other countries in the region, to promote democratization in Nicaragua. Of course, the voice of the European Union is always very important and strong.
Thank you, Jason. Couldn't agree more. The role of the European Union will be very important, and the European Union has already put out documents, communications, where they condemn the actions taken by the Ortega regime, where they condemn actions against opposition parties, against media, against human rights violations. So I guess coming Sunday, the role of the European Union is going to be very critical in joining other countries in the world, and of course this hemisphere, in the sanctions, in the non-recognition, in putting pressure to ensure that a decision is taken to return democracy to Nicaragua. I don't see any other path other than sanctions, but the array there is quite open. Sanctions against the country and sanctions, individual sanctions. And Carlos Fernando mentioned the BESIE and the financial flows. That's a reality. So those are the things that we need to be very strong about once what's going to happen Sunday happens on Sunday, as we know.
Great. I'd just like to thank once again all of you for joining us. Thank the audience, but Carlos Fernando, you can count on our paying close attention to what's happening in Nicaragua in coming weeks, months. hopefully not years, but years as well. President Chinchilla, Vice President Saint Malo, Patrick Ventrell at the State Department, who's in the hot seat on a lot of these things, and of course Jason Marsek and all of the colleagues at the Atlantic Council. So the video of this event will be available on the web. Thank you again for your participation and for your efforts on behalf of democratization and the protection of human rights in Nicaragua. Thank you.
Thank you very much.